It began with silence. The kind that doesn't come from peace, but from something watching. Before dawn on September 15th, 1851, the fields of the Rutled plantation were still, too still. Even the insects had gone quiet, as though the land itself was holding its breath. They said later that the air felt wrong that morning, heavy and metallic, like the taste of blood on the tongue. And then someone whispered it, the name that had already become half legend in the quarters. Caleb. The ghost. 47 enslaved people stood shoulder to shoulder in front of the big house, waiting for punishment to begin. Not one of them would ever give a sworn statement. Not one would leave a written account of what they saw. But the songs they sang decades later still carried fragments, phrases about white cotton, red earth, and the day a man's heart burst open beneath the Mississippi sun. Officially, the record says, accidental exsanguination. A bureaucratic phrase meant to explain away a horror no one dared describe. The county coroner's report, sealed for 73 years, tells another story, one filled with contradictions. A timeline that makes no sense, wounds that could not exist. A plantation ledger that simply stops for 3 weeks, as if someone had torn those pages from time itself. But this isn't a ghost story. It's a study in patience, in precision, in a mind that learned to fight oppression not with rage, but with method. Because before Caleb became myth, he was just a man born into captivity. A man whose body betrayed him with pale skin and colorless eyes. A man hated for looking too much like the people who owned him. His mother had called it a curse. The overseer called it mockery. But Caleb called it armor. History remembers the screams, the bleeding, the disappearance. It forgets the intelligence that made it possible. To understand what really happened that day, you have to look beyond the folklore, beyond the fear. You have to see the architecture of a perfect revenge, one built not on superstition, but on knowledge so dangerous that it was never meant to survive slavery's graveyards. And it begins with a question whispered in every dark corner of Mississippi for generations after. How does a man disappear in a field full of witnesses? By the time the sun crested over the delta horizon, the fields shimmered like broken glass. The air itself seemed to vibrate with heat, warping the world into a fever dream. Those who stood in front of the big house that morning would later remember the silence between the insects returning. A single moment of stillness so absolute that the human mind refused to accept it. It was the kind of silence that feels manufactured, like the world is waiting for something to start or to end. Nathaniel Rutled stepped out onto his porch with bourbon already in hand. The glass caught the sunlight like a shard of gold, and his face looked more corpse than man. Pale, gray-veined, lips trembling slightly from drink, or from something deeper. His body had been betraying him for months, though he didn't know it yet. Inside his veins, the slow architecture of ruin was complete. He was a man alive, only because his killer allowed him to be. Behind him stood Virgil Pence, the overseer. Thick-necked, whip in hand, eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's satisfaction. To him, the morning was routine. Another body to break, another lesson in control. He didn't understand that he, too, was walking inside a design carefully built by someone he considered less than human. Caleb appeared from the quarters at a measured pace. No chains, no guard, just a man walking toward his appointed suffering. He moved like someone who had already accepted death, but those who watched closely noticed something else. There was no hesitation, no plea, no tremor. Only calm calculation behind those eerie pale eyes. For years, the others had whispered that Caleb's silence wasn't fear. It was listening. That every beating he endured, every cruelty he saw, every word uttered by the white man on that porch was being memorized, recorded, and filed away in a part of his mind that never forgot. Some said he could read in tau, ancient in a man's breath, that he knew what you were going to do before you did, and yet, on that morning, he wasn't supernatural. He was simply the smartest man in Warren County, Someone who had turned knowledge into a weapon sharper than any blade. But knowledge without purpose is just survival. Caleb's purpose had been ripening in the dark for years, and the hour had come for it to bloom. The first thing the witnesses remembered was the light. It wasn't the soft, forgiving light of morning, but the kind that exposes everything. Every bead of sweat, every tremor of fear, every sin written across the face of a man who believes himself untouchable. Rutled stood with the bourbon glass balanced on the porch railing, his hand unsteady, the veins beneath his skin dark as ink. Pence stood beside him, whip coiled loosely, like a serpent waiting to strike. The command came with the drawl of a man used to being obeyed. "Bring him forward." 2 men stepped from the line. Ben and Josiah. They'd shared meals with Caleb, prayed with him in whispers, watched him bleed under other punishments. They moved now like ghosts themselves, unwilling but unable to refuse. As they reached for Caleb's arms, he didn't resist, didn't flinch. The stillness was unnerving, like touching a body that's already dead. Then something changed. Ben later said it wasn't movement he felt first, but heat. A sudden warmth that rose from Caleb's skin, pulsing like a heartbeat under marble. He froze, and Caleb turned his head just slightly, his voice low enough that only Ben heard the words, "You don't have to help him today." Ben stepped back. He didn't know why, didn't even realize he was doing it, but some ancient instinct pulled him away. Josiah hesitated too long, and in that hesitation, the moment began to unravel. Rutled saw it. He straightened, offended that his command wasn't being carried out fast enough. "Do it!" he barked, but the words cracked halfway out of his throat. His chest tightened. His skin felt too small for his body. A flash of pain moved through his ribs like lightning. He blamed the bourbon. Caleb's eyes lifted then, and in that instant, something passed between the 2 men. Something that no one watching could ever describe. Not hatred, not fear. Something older, colder, the recognition of a balance being restored. The whip in Pence's hand twitched. The crowd didn't breathe, and just as the first strike should have fallen, Caleb spoke, clearly, audibly, a tone of authority that no slave should ever have possessed. "You will not touch me. Not today. Not ever again." Those words broke the air like thunder, and though no one understood why, several swore that at that exact moment, the fields went silent once more. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The Mississippi air hung thick enough to choke on. Even the cicadas, endless that summer, fell quiet. The only sound was the soft clink of Rutled's bourbon glass as his trembling hand brushed it off the railing. It hit the porch boards and shattered, amber liquid seeping into the wood like blood into cotton. Pence blinked, confused. He had heard defiance before, but never like that. Caleb's words hadn't been shouted. They had rung. Something in his tone felt larger than one man, as if the voice carried every lash that had ever cut through southern air. Rutled's eyes narrowed, his body taut with fury and disbelief. The audacity of it, the idea that a slave could speak to him with authority, ignited every rotten nerve in him. He stepped down from the porch, slowly, one hand on the railing, the other clutching his chest without realizing it. "You think you're more than me, boy?" His words slurred just slightly. "You think that pale skin makes you closer to God? I'll show you what color your blood really is." Caleb didn't move, didn't blink. The world around him seemed to fade. The heat, the murmuring field hands, the shimmer of sun off the cotton leaves. He saw only Rutled, the man who had bought him for $300, the man who had ordered Marcus buried before sundown, the man whose numbers in a ledger meant life or death. For 3 months Caleb had fed that man's destruction in spoonfuls, one dose at a time. And now, it was time to witness it. Rutled lunged. He was fast for a drunk man, but Caleb was faster. One step to the side, one motion, so quick the eye barely caught it. A hand brushed against the master's chest. Nothing dramatic, just contact. A gesture small enough to look like an accident. Rutled froze. His breath hitched. Then came the cough. A deep, wet sound from somewhere low in his chest. A red bloom spread across the wabyalbyung, height linen just above his heart. Pence took half a step forward, whip raised, but his eyes went wide as the color drained from Rutled's face. The master tried to speak, but all that came out was a hoarse gasp, and there it was, the sound the witnesses never forgot. The sound of a man's heart tearing itself apart under the Mississippi sun. The moment stretched thin, like the world itself was waiting to see what kind of story it was about to become. Rutled stumbled backward, clutching his chest. Confusion painted across his face. He looked less like a master now, more like a man who'd just met a truth he couldn't comprehend. His lips moved without sound, and blood began to well at the corners of his mouth. The slaves in the field stood frozen, not out of loyalty, not out of fear, but out of awe. The overseer, Pence, was the first to break from the trance. "Help him!" he barked, his voice high and cracked. But no one moved. Not Ben, not Josiah, not even Patience, who had once fed the man with her own hands. They only watched as Rutled dropped to one knee, then to both. The white of his suit now splattered with crimson. Caleb remained still. Every muscle in his body was quiet, deliberate. There was no triumph in his eyes, only something colder, heavier. He'd seen death before. He'd caused it before, in smaller ways. But this was different. This was the end of an equation years in the making. Pence rushed forward and caught Rutled by the shoulders. But as he did, a sound escaped the dying man's throat, a gurgling rasp that wasn't quite human. His skin was slick, almost fever-hot. Then something worse. The blood coming from his nose wasn't flowing. It was pouring. Too much, too fast. It soaked Pence's shirt, his hands, the porch, dripping down through the boards onto the packed earth below. Someone in the back began to pray, voice trembling, words tumbling out too fast to understand. Rutled turned his face upward, eyes bloodshot and bulging, staring directly at Caleb. His lips trembled, forming words no one could hear. Caleb stepped closer, just once, and whispered something so quietly that even those nearest couldn't catch it. Rutled's head jerked, his mouth opened wide in a silent scream, and then his entire bodies, he convulsed. When he hit the ground, it wasn't a fall. It was like the life was pulled from him, drawn out and claimed by something unseen, and for a long, unbearable moment, there was nothing. Just the smell of iron and sweat and silence that had weight. Then Caleb turned, slow and steady, and began walking toward the cotton fields. He didn't run. He didn't look back. By the time anyone thought to follow him, he was gone. At first, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind dragging through the cotton rows, carrying with it the faint hiss of something ending. Then Pence shouted, half command, half hysteria, telling them to move, to fetch the doctor, to find Caleb. But no one obeyed. Not out of rebellion, out of paralysis, out of the knowledge that whatever had just happened was not something a doctor could undo. Rutled lay twisted on the porch boards, eyes open, unseeing. The skin around his neck and jaw was turning the color of ash. His veins had gone dark, almost black beneath the surface, as though something inside him had burned through from within. Blood pooled beneath his shoulders, thin and bright, too much to be natural. Patience knelt near the steps, not to help, but to witness. Her face was unreadable. There were tears, yes, but they were not for the dead man. Virgil Pence staggered backward, wiping blood from his arms. He couldn't seem to stop shaking. The overseer, who had once swung a whip without hesitation, now looked at his hands like they no longer belonged to him. He just fell, he stammered. But the words died in his throat. Every pair of eyes turned toward him, waiting for explanation, command, direction. There was none. Behind them, the field shimmered in the heat. For a moment, some swore they saw movement. something pale slipping through the rows of cotton, like a man-shaped reflection of light. Others said that was just their eyes, dazed by fear and sun. Either way, when they searched the quarters, the woods, the creek, Caleb was gone. Not a footprint, not a trace. By the time Dr. Hiram Kendrick arrived from town, it was too late. He examined the body in silence, brow furrowed, the pages of his ledger fluttering in the faint wind. Massive vascular rupture, he muttered finally. Complete systemic failure. He had never seen anything like it. The blood vessels in the man's body had burst as though pressure had built up from inside. No visible wound, no explanation. Pence asked what caused it. The doctor shook his head. Whatever it was waiting for him. That night, the plantation house stood dark. No lamps, no voices. Only the cicadas had returned, louder now, their song vibrating through the humid air. And in the quarters, someone began humming. A slow, low tune that no one had heard before. A song about a man made of pale fire, walking where no whip could follow. By dawn the next morning, the story had already started to bend. Fear is quick that way. It reshapes truth faster than the living can bury the dead. Officially, Nathaniel Rutled died of ruptured vessels due to heatstroke and excessive drink. That's what the doctor wrote. Neat and final, in a hand that trembled slightly as the ink dried. But the people who'd been there knew better. They'd seen something leave him. Something invisible but heavy enough to stay behind. Pence burned the porch boards before sunrise. He said it was to purify the place. But those who watched knew it was shame. The blood had soaked too deep into the wood. And even after the fire, the ground beneath it stayed dark. They shoveled dirt over it, then whitewashed the new boards. But for weeks, anyone who walked across that spot said they could hear it, like a heartbeat under the planks. The other plantations in Warren County heard whispers before the week was out. The tale grew faster than cotton. Some said Caleb had slit the master's throat. Others swore he'd struck him with lightning called down from the sky. None of it made sense, but every version ended the same. The white man dead, the albino vanished. In the slave quarters, fear mixed with something new, something dangerous. Not joy, not exactly, but a recognition that power had shifted, even if just for a moment. Old Isaiah, the one who'd spoken of slow work, warned them to stay quiet. The ghost's work ain't done, he said. It's just started. He's walking through every man's dream now. The white townspeople handled it differently. They needed order, explanation, hierarchy restored. So they built a story clean enough to swallow. The slave had run. The master had died of his own excesses. The world was as it had always been. But when two hunting parties set out to find Caleb, one north toward the river, one west through the cypress woods, neither found a single footprint. 3 dogs sent after him didn't return. The third night, when the wind shifted from the delta, they said the field smelled faintly of medicine and iron. The same bitter trace that had once tainted the well water. And under that, for those willing to listen close enough, the ground itself seemed to hum, low, rhythmic, deliberate. Like something alive, 3 days after the death, the heat broke. But no one felt relief. The air had turned sharp like metal left in the sun too long, and the nights were colder than they should have been for September. The overseer, Pence, had stopped sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, he said he saw Rutled standing at the edge of his bed, the white linen suit still soaked through with blood, staring without accusation, without forgiveness. Just staring. He tried to drink it away, the way men like him always did. But the bourbon didn't burn right anymore. It tasted like dirt and sickness. The first bottle he poured down his throat came back up red. He told himself it was his stomach, not his conscience. Still, when he looked out across the cotton fields, he swore he saw movement between the rows, something pale slipping through the plants at dawn. gone by the time he blinked. He wasn't the only one. Dr. Kendrick, the coroner, returned 2 days later to re-examine the body before burial. But when he opened the casket, he found the blood pooled at the bottom had turned almost black, thick as tar. The smell of iron was so strong he staggered back and retched into the dirt. "This isn't decomposition," he muttered. "It's reaction." He closed the coffin and ordered it sealed immediately. He didn't sign his name on the death certificate until the following week. Patience, the house slave, moved through the silent rooms like a ghost herself. She washed the blood-stained sheets in the river that night and said the water turned cloudy, not red, but milky white, and didn't clear until she sang. When the others asked what song she'd used, she said it wasn't a song she'd learned. It had come from somewhere deep in her chest, where grief meets relief. By the 7th night, the white men who had come to search the woods began to whisper among themselves that the field hands were right, that Caleb hadn't run, that he'd never left at all. One man claimed he'd seen a figure standing in the field at dawn, motionless, head tilted toward the big house. When he'd looked again, the rows were empty, but the cotton plants nearest the spot were bent down, crushed in a perfect circle, as if someone had been standing there all night. By the 2nd week, the county began to rot from the inside. Not the land. It still looked the same, rows upon rows of green and white stretching toward the horizon. But the men who ran it. Their tempers grew short. Their sleep grew thin. It started with the smaller plantations along Deer Creek. Arguments about missing tools, about who was supposed to watch the quarters, about what the field hands whispered after dark. Then it spread to the taverns in Vicksburg, where talk of Caleb had turned from curiosity to contagion. Pence stopped leaving the property altogether. He kept a lantern burning in every room of the overseer's quarters, claiming he couldn't stand the dark. The field hands avoided him now. The whip in his hand shook too much to be feared. One night, Ben, the same man who had once been ordered to hold Caleb down, found Pence outside the barn, barefoot, muttering at the ground. "He's in the dirt," he whispered, listening. Dr. Kendrick withdrew to town, but even there, he couldn't escape the stories. His hands had begun to ache as if burned whenever he tried to write. He tried to pray, but the words tasted like iron. When his apprentice asked what was wrong, he simply said, "We buried a man the land didn't want." The white men began to meet in secret. Planters, merchants, overseers, trying to decide how to quiet what was spreading. The problem wasn't just fear. It was that the slaves had stopped bowing their heads when spoken to. They still worked, still moved when ordered, but the submission had gone from their eyes. And every night, from one end of the county to the other, someone was said to be humming that same low song, the one Patience had sung by the river. No one knew how they all knew it. When the first plantation fire started, they called it lightning. When the second burned, on a clear, windless night, they stopped trying to explain. Pence went missing. On the 15th day, his boots were found by the creek. The ground around them churned up, like he'd fought something that left no footprints. The water nearby ran cloudy, milky white, and smelled faintly of bitter herbs. The men in town said it was coincidence. The field hands said it was balance. And out in the fields, beneath the hum of insects, there was another sound now. Slow, deliberate, almost like breathing. By the time the first frost came early that year, it was no longer just a plantation story. The whispers had spread into town like a sickness, moving through the church pews, the tavern doors, the courthouse steps. Vicksburg was a place that pretended it didn't believe in ghosts, but now even the men who mocked such talk refused to walk home alone after sundown. The official story, Rutled's heart, Pence's accident, the runaway still missing, held up on paper. But paper was for the living. The nights told another truth. The dogs barked at nothing. Every bell in the county seemed to toll off beat. and the air hung heavy with a strange sweet-sour smell, like medicine poured over rot. Dr. Kendrick stopped opening his practice. His housekeeper found him one morning sitting at his desk, his lamp still burning, his eyes fixed on the wall. The ink on his ledger had run, the page soaked through with what looked like water, or tears. Only one line was legible. "It moves beneath us." In the slave quarters across the county, something had changed. Work continued, but the fear was no longer one-sided. Men and women began leaving tiny marks in the dirt, circles of crushed cotton and ground chalk. They whispered to the ground before stepping onto it. They didn't call it prayer, but it had that shape. Some said Caleb's name out loud, others hummed his song. They didn't mean to summon anything. They meant to remember. At night, lights were seen in the fields, soft glows, like lanterns carried low, though no one ever found who held them. Some claimed they saw a figure there, skin pale as bone, moving through the rows. Sometimes it walked. Sometimes it didn't seem to touch the ground at all. The county sheriff led one last search, riding out with 5 armed men and 3 hounds. They didn't come back. 2 weeks later, one of the hounds wandered home. Its fur had turned gray, its eyes cloten, muted white, and it refused to cross the porch. After that, no one said Caleb's name above a whisper. But the song never stopped. It moved through the nights like a pulse, quiet but constant. Even now, some say if you stand at the edge of the old Rutled place when the air goes still, you can hear it under your feet, the slow thrum of something alive in the soil, and if you listen long enough, you might just hear breathing. The land changed hands 6 times over the next century, but nobody ever stayed. The county grew. Railroads came and went. The war took sons and sent back ghosts. By the 1950s, the old Rutled place was nothing more than a collapsing frame house and a field of wild cane. Kids dared each other to walk through it at night. Hunters used the barn for shelter and swore the air inside was colder than outside, even in August. By 2008, the property belonged to a development firm out of Jackson. They wanted to build luxury homes on what their paperwork called Parcel 14A. They didn't know what the locals still called it, the listening ground. The firm sent a team of surveyors one October morning. 3 of them, one from Jackson, one from Biloxi, and a young woman from Vicksburg named Maya Rutled. She hadn't known, not until her supervisor pointed it out on the deed, that she carried the same name as the family who'd once owned the place. She'd laughed it off then, but when she stepped out of the truck, something in the air felt wrong. Too quiet. They found the remnants of the big house first. A few bricks, the skeleton of a chimney, a set of stone steps leading to nothing. The ground around it was soft, almost spongy. Their equipment started to glitch. Compass needles drifted. The GPS marked the same coordinates no matter where they stood. That afternoon, Maya wandered toward the creek while the others packed up. The air smelled faintly of metal and wild mint. She crouched near the water, tracing her fingers through the silt. That's when she saw it. A faint ring pressed into the ground, wide as a man's shoulders, where the grass wouldn't grow. The soil inside was pale, almost white. She touched it. The earth was warm. That night, she couldn't sleep. The sound of her phone charger humming by the bed began to sync with her heartbeat. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. When she closed her eyes, she saw rows of cotton moving in the wind, though there was no wind. A man's voice whispered, not in anger, not in warning, but in recognition. "You came back." She woke before dawn, heart pounding, the smell of iron thick in her nose. On the bedside table lay her field notebook, open to a blank page. Only one line had been written, in her own handwriting, though she had no memory of writing it. He's still listening. Maya told herself it was exhaustion, that she'd just picked up a bit of local ghost lore without realizing it. But when she went back through her notes the next morning, the handwriting still looked like hers. The pen stroke pressure, the slant, everything matched. She drove to the Warren County Courthouse, a place that still smelled of dust and old glue, to dig through the property archives. The clerk, a man who'd been there 30 years, pointed her to the basement stacks. She spent half a day combing through ledgers, transfers of title, taxes unpaid, drought reports. Nothing unusual until she reached an unlabeled folder wedged between two maps. Inside was a letter dated 1853, 2 years after the incident. The ink was brown, the paper brittle. It was addressed to Nathaniel Rutled, Jr., a name she'd never seen in any family record. "The ground will not yield," it read in looping script. "The field is quiet. The hands hum at night. You were right to leave the place. It will not forgive us." There was no signature, only a faint fingerprint at the bottom. Smudged, pale. When Maya showed it to the clerk, his eyes flicked up from the page. "You sure you want to keep digging in that?" he asked softly. "Folks say the Rutled line ended on that porch. No son survived." But the letter was proof of someone else. A survivor, a name erased. That night Maya couldn't shake the feeling that the letter had been waiting for her. She scanned it under lamplight, zooming in on the paper fibers. Embedded faintly between the words, she saw something strange. A repeating watermark of a circle, like the crushed grass symbols from the site. Then, as the lamp buzzed, her laptop chimed. A file syncing from an unknown drive. Folder name, Caleb Archive. Inside were scanned pages of plantation inventories, accounts written in a different hand, the entries careful and mathematical. Each line listed rat assets, ions, cotton weights, and, besides several names, a tiny mark. A small white circle. The last entry dated August 1851 read, "The work is done. Let the soil remember." Maya's cursor hovered over the page as the document flickered, once, twice, and then her screen went black. In the reflection, she thought she saw movement behind her, a pale figure standing in the doorway, silent, patient. When she turned, the room was empty, but the smell of iron and mint hung in the air, and from somewhere beneath the floorboards came that slow, steady rhythm again. Thrum, 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 as though the ground itself were keeping time. Maya didn't sleep that night. The sound beneath the floorboards pulsed like a heartbeat that wasn't hers. Steady, patient, deliberate. By dawn, she'd packed her notes, the strange letter, and a recorder, and drove straight back to the university. She needed someone else to see what she was seeing before she began to question her sanity. She met with Professor Lionel Stokes, an aging historian whose specialty was antebellum agricultural records. He had spent decades tracing plantation economics, the invisible machinery of slavery that turned people into numbers. When she placed the letter and the scanned inventory sheets on his desk, he went completely still. "This mark," he said finally, tapping one of the small white circles with a pen, "isn't decorative. It's an early cipher. Some planters used marks to indicate deaths, punishments, transfers. But this looks like an internal record, something not meant for the ledgers that auditors or partners would ever see." He adjusted his glasses, frowning. "And this handwriting, it isn't Rutled's. Whoever wrote this had formal training, perhaps a bookkeeper or an educated slave." Maya hesitated, then told him about the name Caleb, the erased weeks, and the whispers that persisted for a century. Stokes leaned back, exhaling. "I've heard fragments, old folklore out of Warren County. An albino field hand who made the master's blood turn to water. People say the soil stayed red for years, but that's just story." "Except the story lines up with the records," Maya said. "The missing weeks, the sudden death, the inheritance records that vanish right after, and now this cipher." Stokes nodded slowly. "If this is real, Miss Hall, You've stumbled on something dangerous to someone's narrative. A story that was meant to die with those ledgers. He paused, studying her face. You said the ground was humming. She blinked. Yes. Oh, you? He didn't answer. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out a photocopy of an 1891 diary from a local surveyor. The entry for September 15th, 1891 read, "The soil at the old Rutled place hums like a beehive. Instruments detect vibrations beneath the north field, rhythmic and unbroken. Locals refuse to enter after dark." Maya read it twice, her skin crawling. Stokes lowered his voice. The humming, the cipher, the erased records. It's not folklore, Maya. It's a containment. He looked her dead in the eye. Whatever Caleb did out there wasn't just revenge. It was designed to keep something buried. Stokes waited for the door to shut before he spoke again. Do you know what happens when enough human blood seeps into Delta soil? He asked, his voice low, almost reverent. The iron binds with the clay. Over time, it changes the ground's resonance. Farmers say the fields remember. Maya leaned forward, the hum of the air vent growing louder. Or maybe that was her own pulse. You're saying the ground can record? Stokes nodded. Not in the way you think. Not memory like a mind, but chemistry, vibration, frequency. Certain minerals hold trauma, and certain patterns of sound or ritual can awaken that stored energy. That's why they called it containment. He tapped the diary again. Someone didn't just kill a man. They built a field that would never forget. He pulled another folder from his drawer. Photocopies of 19th century agricultural reports. After 1851, the Rutled land showed abnormal growth patterns. Crops on one half of the property flourished unnaturally. The other half, Caleb's section, refused to yield a single healthy stalk. Every few years, a new owner tried again, always the same result. Maya thought of the symbols carved into the cotton gin, the circle marks in the ledger, the pulsing under her feet. You think Caleb knew what he was doing? Oh, he knew, Stokes said. His mother came from Saint-Domingue, Haitian soil. She would have known the old systems. They weren't witchcraft. They were designs. Ritual engineering, you could call it. Using human will, natural chemistry, and pattern to rewrite a place. He leaned closer. Caleb wasn't making revenge. He was making a seal. The word hung in the air like smoke. That night, Maya sat in her apartment, replaying his words. She found herself whispering, "A seal for what?" before realizing she didn't want the answer. She pulled up the Caleb archive folder again, scrolling through until she found a final, corrupted file labeled root. When she opened it, lines of code flickered like a living heartbeat. Embedded in the text was a sentence that shouldn't have been there. Written as if for her. He was patient. The land still listens. The hum returned, faint at first, then louder. The glass of water on her desk trembled, rippling in perfect rhythm with the sound coming from beneath the floor. And then, from her speakers, though no audio file was open, came a voice, calm and deliberate. You opened the seal, Maya. The screen went black. When the voice came through her laptop speakers, Maya froze. For a second, she thought it was a glitch, an artifact of corrupted audio. But then it spoke again, softer, almost human. You opened the seal, Maya. She ripped the plug from the wall. The hum didn't stop. It shifted, climbing from the floor to the walls, vibrating the air itself. Books trembled on the shelf. Dust drifted down in thin gray veils. Her phone screen lit up without her touching it. A notification flashed. One new comment. User, Caleb 11851. The message read only, "The field remembers." Her heart hammered. She turned the phone face down, but the vibration continued. Steady, rhythmic, like the heartbeat she'd heard in the soil. She forced herself to breathe, opened her recorder, and began to narrate. Entry 13, she whispered. Possible audio interference linked to archival file corruption. Or, she swallowed hard. Or something else. The lights flickered. For a moment, the reflection on her black screen showed not her own face, but a pale man behind her shoulder. Eyes the color of raw meat, skin almost translucent. When she spun around, the chair was empty. By dawn, she'd decided to leave town. But when she stepped outside, the world felt wrong. The humidity was too thick, the air tasted metallic, and the cicadas had fallen silent. The sound of engines, birds, all of it, gone. Only the pulse beneath her boots remained. At the end of the road stood an old man in a hat, the courthouse clerk from before. He was waiting, hands folded. "It's awake again," he said quietly, "and it's listening through you." Maya stared at him. "What do you mean? Through me?" He didn't answer. He just pointed toward the horizon. The morning sun rose blood red over the delta, and in the heat shimmer she could see them. Faint white figures bending in rhythm, row after row, harvesting nothing. When she blinked, "Ed, they were gone," the old man whispered. "He's still working the field, Miss Hall. Always has been." Maya drove until the road ended. Every mile marker behind her disappeared into fog, and when she checked her phone's GPS, the map refused to load. The screen showed only a red circle pulsing like a wound. She tried the radio. Static. Then, faintly, a voice beneath it, whispering names she didn't know. The tone wasn't angry. It sounded more like someone counting crops. When she finally reached the county line, the road was blocked by a fallen cypress. She stepped out to move it, but the air felt wrong again. Thick, humming faintly, as though the entire landscape were breathing. The fields on either side shimmered, endless and silver white in the morning haze. Then she noticed the cotton. It was blooming out of season. Every stalk was tall, impossible, and the bowls glowed faintly like candle wicks. She reached for one, and saw that it wasn't cotton at all. The fibers were hair, pale hair, human. She stumbled backward, tripping into the ditch, and when she looked up, the fog rolled across the field in waves, curling into shapes, faces, dozens of them, half-formed, whispering her name. Maya. The voice came from all directions. It wasn't angry. It was patient, calm. The way a teacher speaks when you're close to understanding. She ran back to the car, slammed the door, and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, whispering, "It's not real. It's not real. It's not real." But then the voice answered from the back seat. That's what he said too. She turned, and the passenger seat was occupied. The man sitting there looked ordinary until she noticed the skin. Paper white, too smooth, too still. His eyes were the color of diluted wine, fixed on her with no emotion at all. "You shouldn't have read the ledgers," he said quietly. "They weren't meant for the living." Maya's throat closed. "Caleb?" He didn't respond. He only looked toward the fields. "The seal isn't what you think," he murmured. "It isn't to hold me in. It's to hold them out." And then, as the hum deepened into a roar, she saw movement in the distance. The soil itself shifting, swelling, like something beneath it was trying to breathe. Caleb turned back to her, voice barely above a whisper. "If you want to live, don't run. Listen." She didn't move. The hum pressed against the car like air before a storm, vibrating through the windows, through her bones. Caleb's pale eyes never blinked. "What's under there?" Maya whispered. He looked toward the horizon, where the fields shimmered in waves. "Not what," he said. "Who? The ones that never left. The ones this country fed upon." The soil began to heave, small ripples like breath, then subsided. "They're trapped," she asked. They're contained, Caleb answered. The field took their pain and made it still. I used my body to close it. The iron in blood, the roots in the soil, the words in the air. It keeps balance. You. He turned his head sharply toward her. You opened the ledger. You spoke the names. You woke the field. Maya shook her head, fighting tears. I didn't mean to. Meaning doesn't matter, he said flatly. Only attention. You looked, and now they know you see them. Outside, the fog thickened, and within it, outlines of figures began to move. Some tall, some bent, some crawling. The whispering returned, layered now, like wind in dry leaves. Every word carried a single pulse. Remember. Caleb reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small folded square of fabric. My mother's charm, he said. It binds sight to silence. But it only works once. If you take it, you'll forget everything you've learned. The seal will hold again. Maya stared at it, trembling. And if I don't? Then the field will finish what it started. Through the windshield, she saw shapes gathering at the edge of the road. Translucent hands pushing up from the soil, clutching at air. The hum was now a single, endless tone, vibrating through her chest like a second heartbeat. She turned back toward Caleb, but he was gone. The passenger seat was empty. The air smelled faintly of smoke and iron. In her lap lay the folded square of fabric. On it, stitched in D, arc thread, was a single phrase. The field remembers. Maya lifted it, her fingers shaking. As she unfolded the cloth, the hum stopped. Total silence. And then, very softly, from beneath the car, came the sound of soil shifting, a breath drawn in. The silence that followed was worse than the humming. It was the kind of silence that listens back. Maya sat perfectly still, her hand hovering over the square of cloth. The fabric trembled between her fingers, as though it had a pulse of its own. Then came the first crack beneath the car. A dry, splintering sound. The ground was opening. She scrambled out, boots sinking into the soft red dirt. The fog had lifted just enough for her to see the old fields stretching in every direction, the horizon rippling like heat over metal. And then she saw them, rows upon rows of figures rising slowly from the soil. Not corpses, not ghosts, shadows of people, their bodies made from ash and clay, their eyes hollow but bright as coals. Caleb's voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It remembers what was done, and it remembers who did it. Maya backed away, heart pounding. I didn't. But the figures didn't move toward her. They faced the ground, kneeling, their hands pressed flat to the dirt. The hum began again, low, rhythmic, but no longer violent. It was a chant, a language she couldn't understand. The soil pulsed, something beneath it stirred. Vast, slow, ancient. Not human, not memory, but the shape of grief itself, heavy and deliberate. The land itself had been taught to obey. And now, after a century and a half, it was learning how to speak. Maya fell to her knees, pressing the cloth against her chest. Tell me what to do, she whispered. Finish it, the voice said. Close the seal. She looked down and realized the fabric was gone. In her hands was dirt, wet, red, alive. The same iron-rich soil that had swallowed Caleb. The same earth that had fed the fields and held the dead quiet for so long. Her recorder, still in her pocket, clicked on by itself. The last entry she had made began to play, her voice faint and shaking. The field remembers. But now Anat. Her voice joined hers, repeating the same words. Deeper, layered. Thousands of voices overlapping until the air itself quivered. Maya lifted her face toward the horizon, tears cutting through the dust. Then let it remember everything, she whispered. And with that, the humming stopped. The soil settled. The horizon held its breath. The red sun rose again over Warren County, burning through the mist, and for the first time in 170 years, the fields were still. 3 months later, a research team from the University of Mississippi arrived in Warren County to resurvey the old Rutled tract. The region had been slated for redevelopment, a solar farm and a small historical site, but the land proved difficult. Every attempt to map it digitally produced static interference. GPS signals cut out within a mile of the northern field. The soil sensors overheated. By the third day, the project lead, Dr. Whitaker, noted something unusual in his field log. Soil density irregular. Iron content 10 times higher than surrounding tracks. Audible vibrations recorded at dawn. Origin undetermined. That night, one of the grad students found a small handheld recorder buried in the dust near the old fence line. It was waterlogged, mud-stained, but the name scratched into the casing was still visible. M. Hall. The device contained only one file, half erased by static. They played it in the trailer. At first, silence. Then a woman's voice, calm but trembling. If anyone finds this, know that it's not a haunting. It's a reckoning. The field isn't cursed. It's conscious. It learned from us. And now, it rests. The recording ended with the faint sound of breathing. Not labored, just slow, rhythmic, patient. Like something asleep. The next morning, when the team packed up, Dr. Whitaker noticed a patch of the field that looked freshly turned. He brushed at it with his boot and froze. There, pressed into the earth, was a single square of fabric, bleached almost white, threadbare, embroidered with a single phrase in rust-colored thread. The field remembers. He pocketed it without saying a word. Later, as he drove away, the radio filled with faint static. Beneath it, a whisper threaded through the signal, soft, steady, and familiar. Attention is enough. Whitaker frowned, turned the volume down. The whisper faded. Outside his window, the field lay quiet again, rows of new cotton stretching toward the horizon. But when the wind moved across them, for a brief second, the plants bent in unison. Not with the breeze, but with the rhythm of a heartbeat, and then the land was still, forever remembering.